I'm Oren Steer, and I direct the FIU Judaic Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences School of International and Public Affairs. I'm also Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director in the Department of Religious Studies. Honored members of the FIU and Simon Wiesenthal Center Boards of Trustees, FIU Foundation Board of Directors, President's Council members, deans, directors, College of Arts and Sciences, and SEPA board members, faculty colleagues, students, my students, community leaders, and guests, welcome to tonight's lecture. As we are a student-centered university, I'd like to start by recognizing our two FIU student government presidents, Anthony Rianda, president at the Modesto Maidí campus and member of the FIU Board of Trustees, and Shalom Nystein, president at the Biscayne Bay campus and member of the Foundation Board of Directors. And a special welcome to FIU Provost Dr. Douglas Wartsock. My friends, a passage from the book of Deuteronomy reads, Tzedek, tzedek tirduf, justice, justice shall you pursue. The repeated word tzedek is understood, wow, to be emphatic. Justice, justice, ringing from the rooftops, as it were. But the Hasidic leader, Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshishka, says we should read the passage differently, that it's telling us to pursue justice justly, or else it is not justice. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, and especially Dr. Efraim Zuroff, whom President Rosenberg will introduce in a moment, are engaged in just such a pursuit. And I want to thank tonight's speaker for his efforts and for donating his time to address us this evening. I'd also like to thank Aryeh Rubin and the Targum Shlishi Foundation, underwriters of Dr. Zuroff's current work. We are grateful to our sponsors for this evening's presentation, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, particularly its Southern Director, Linda Slavin, and most especially the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Foundation, represented tonight by Morris and Anita Broad and Ann Bussell. Their father, Shepard Broad, was named one of the 19 heroes of Israel for his efforts in establishing the Jewish state. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Dr. Kenneth Furton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and Dr. John Stack, Director of the School of International and Public Affairs. Their staffs and staff across the university who worked to make this evening a smooth success, so far at least. Thank you all. The FIU Judaic Studies program was founded over 25 years ago, and to paraphrase the Yiddish partisan song, we're still here. We offer an 18-credit interdisciplinary undergraduate certificate, coordinated by 14 core and advisory faculty members and enhanced by 11 additional affiliated faculty, with courses drawn from the humanities, social sciences, and fine arts. Our central efforts have been in outreach at both our campuses and throughout Miami-Dade County, enhancing student learning experiences and enriching the community with intellectual discussion and debate. Over the past 10 years that I've been affiliated with the program, we've sponsored or co-sponsored over 120 public lectures and symposia on topics ranging from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the status of women in Judaism to Kabbalah. We have two areas of particular concern: our Latin American Jewry series, presented in partnership with FIU's Latin American and Caribbean Center, and our annual Holocaust Studies lectures. Unknown to most, FIU has a Jewish student population estimated at 3,000 to 4,000, nearly 10% of the student body. We have a vision for an open, integrated Jewish life at FIU, a social life spearheaded by our Hillel Second Generation Foundation, H2G student community, a spiritual life led by our two campus rabbis, Rabbi Sag Freiberg of the Jewish Collegiate Learning Exchange, and Rabbi Levi Friedman of Chabad at FIU. And an intellectual life led by the Judaic Studies program in the School of International and Public Affairs, and relevant, as your attendance tonight attests, to everyone. Now please allow me to introduce FIU's new president, Mark B. Rosenberg, who brings 35 years of experience in higher education leadership to his new post. A specialist and a scholar on Latin America, Dr. Rosenberg was one of the principal architects of FIU's growth and expansion during the past decade. Most recently, he served as chancellor of the State University System of Florida. But on a more personal note, Dr. Rosenberg was FIU provost when I received tenure. I was a research fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. at the time. And Dr. Rosenberg called me at home that April evening saying, well, it isn't official yet. We still have to wait for the president to make the final decision. But if you have a bottle of Manischewitz handy, I suggest now is the time to crack it open. Ladies and gentlemen, President Mark Rosenberg.
Oren, thank you. I had forgotten about that little episode. Well, in fact, universities are communities of memory and hope. And what brings us here this evening is our memory about a dreadful, dreadful decade, and our hope that it's never repeated. Not just for the Jewish people and the other victims of the Holocaust, but for so many countless others who today suffer from a calamity that if it isn't the same, it's nearly the same. I want to share with you a number, 52436, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I am pleased to welcome Efraim Zuroff. He's the chief Nazi hunter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, director of its Israel office over the last 30 years. He's been in the relentless pursuit of war criminals. He became the first academic director in 1978 of the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. Then he was hired by the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations to be their sole researcher in Israel. During his 6 years in that capacity, his efforts assisted in the preparation of cases against numerous Nazi war criminals living in the United States. In 1986, his research uncovered the post-war escape of hundreds and hundreds of Nazi war criminals to Australia, to Canada, to Great Britain, and to other countries. And he then rejoined the Wiesenthal Center to coordinate its international efforts to bring Holocaust perpetrators to justice. In the summer of 2002, together with Ari Rubin, who we're pleased to have here today, director of the Targum Slishi Foundation, Dr. Zuroff launched Operation Last Chance, which offers financial rewards for information that will facilitate the conviction and punishment of Nazi war criminals. It is a campaign to locate and bring to justice as many as possible of the worst Nazi criminals before their ill health or death spares them from trial. So far, the project has initiated in 13 countries and has yielded the names of about 530 previously unknown suspects, 100 of which have already been submitted to local prosecutors. He describes himself as one-third detective, one-third historian, one-third political lobbyist, and he's now serving or has served as official advisor to the Rwandan government in their efforts to bring justice to the perpetrators of that country's genocide. Over the years, he's published more than 250 articles or reports on various topics related to the Holocaust and other issues of concern to the Jewish world. And I think, Dr. Zuroff, you can see by the number of people in attendance here that there is concern. And I promise you, if you come back in a few years when we open our new School of International and Public Affairs and we open our new Broad auditorium that has been generously endowed by the Broad family, it'll be the largest auditorium, 500 at this university, and we will fill that too for you, sir. Your Operation Last Chance, one man's quest to bring Nazi criminals to justice. I think a number of you have seen it. We do have it available for you to purchase afterwards, and I know that Dr. Zuroff will sign it. Now, I mentioned to you 52436 because you see the Rosenbergs are not just here because of our interest or concern. My mother was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So we have a personal interest in ensuring that those who perpetrated those terrible crimes against so many whose families were lucky to survive, like I subsequently am the descendant of a survivor, so that we can have justice and we can rest to know that those who committed those terrible crimes are put to justice. History has shown us that this can happen again. Indeed, it has happened again. So telling and retelling this story, telling and retelling it, is a powerful way to combat the silence of those who stood by as those Holocausts took place, and to fulfill the promise, plus jamais, as it's written on the entryway of a number of concentration camps that are now parks and memorials, never again. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our hero, Dr. Efraim Zuroff.
Okay, thank you, President Rosenberg. I think it was Lyndon Johnson who, after hearing a particularly effusive introduction, said that his father would have enjoyed it, but only his mother would have believed it. First of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here at FIU, and I want to thank everyone involved in creating tonight's event for this wonderful welcome. The people, of course, at FIU, and especially our director here in Southern Florida, Linda Slavin. There are basically three reasons why a person writes a nonfiction book. One is to tell a story, either his own story or someone else's story. A second is to plead a cause, and the third is to expose an injustice. My book, Operation Last Chance, basically has all of those elements. It's the story of how a young boy growing up in Brooklyn, dreaming of basketball stardom, ended up a Nazi hunter. It's also the story of the efforts over the last 30 years to try and bring Nazi war criminals to justice all over the world, and that's, of course, the cause. And the injustice is the fact that so many countries are not willing to cooperate and to bring these people to trial and to hold these Nazi war criminals accountable. Tonight, as interesting as my own story might be, and if you're interested, you can read the book, I, of course, want to focus on the other two elements, and I want to answer a simple question. Many times when I meet people and tell them what I do, the reaction is, do you mean to say there are still Nazi war criminals alive? Do you mean to say there's still someone to chase? Aren't they all old? Aren't they all dead already? So I want to begin with some illuminating statistics. Every year, our office in Jerusalem puts out an annual report on the investigation and prosecution of Nazi war criminals all over the world. And our latest report is going to be presented this coming Thursday at the international headquarters of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And it tells an interesting story. It covers the period from April 1st, 2008 to March 31st, 2009. And during that period, 85 new investigations of Nazi war criminals were initiated in some 7, I think, or 8 countries. And as of April 1st, 2009, there were at least 706 ongoing investigations of Nazi war criminals in about 12 or 13 different countries. In other words, this is something that is going on as we speak. And as a matter of fact, in the last 7 weeks, there's been legal action taken against 4 out of the people on our most wanted list. Many of you probably know that Ivan Demjanjuk, who served as a guard at the Sobibor death camp, is in jail in Munich awaiting his trial. Probably less people know that Charles Zente, a person whom we discovered in the framework of Operation Last Chance, is currently in jail in Perth, awaiting extradition to Hungary. And just last week, the Australian Minister of Internal Affairs, Brendan O'Connor, approved that extradition. And we are almost there. There's possibility of a final appeal, but it looks very certain that he will be the first Nazi war criminal against whom Australia took successful legal action, which is extremely important. And his trial in Hungary will be the first trial of a Hungarian Nazi war criminal since Hungary became a democracy. There's a trial in Aachen of Heinrich Bohr, a Dutch SS hitman. And in Budapest, the Hungarian police arrested, at least temporarily, unfortunately only temporarily, but took away the passport of Sándor Capiro, another case discovered in the framework of Operation Last Chance, a man who was among the organizers of the massacre in the city of Novi Sad on January 23, 1942, of at least 1,300 civilians. So this thing is going on, and the question really is, here we are 64 years after the end of World War II. All of this should have been done years ago. Why has it taken so long? How is it still going on now? And those are the questions that I basically want to answer for you tonight. There are basically two major events that took place during the last 35 years that gave a tremendous impetus to the hunt for Nazi war criminals. The first was the discovery initially in the United States and later in the other Anglo-Saxon countries that thousands of Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe, posing as refugees, had entered the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, and New Zealand during the first decade after the end of World War II. And the second was the breakup of the Soviet Union and the transition from communism to democracy in Eastern Europe. And there's no question that these two events gave a tremendous push to those efforts. And I want to just explain how this happened and tell you a little bit about my role. And in order to do that, we have to go back to the history of the Shoah and talk a little bit about the issue of collaboration. Everyone knows that the German and Austrian Nazis were, of course, the main perpetrators of Holocaust crimes. But what is less known is the fact that they had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of local assistants, helpers. Now, in every single country in Europe that was either under Nazi occupation or allied with Nazi Germany, the Nazis made a studied effort to try and recruit local help. And there were two reasons for this. One was ideological, the other one was practical. The ideological reason was that they wanted to show that it wasn't only they who wanted to be rid of the Jews. Everyone wanted to be rid of the Jews, and what better proof could there be if other peoples joined in this effort? The practical reason was that if they were able to enlist local assistance, that meant freeing Germans and Austrians for tasks elsewhere. And of course, if Jews were trying to hide, or if Jews were trying to escape, it obviously was far easier to fool a German from Hamburg or an Austrian from Vienna than it was to fool their neighbor down the block who knew them, who knew the language, who knew the logistics, and could tell the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew. Now, the collaboration, which was so critical, took different forms. And there's a very significant difference between the collaboration in Western, Northern, and Southern Europe and the collaboration in Eastern Europe. The French police, the Belgian police, the Dutch police, police in Greece and Norway, the administration, they all helped in the initial stages of the final solution, defining who is a Jew, stealing the Jews' properties and businesses, concentrating Jews, rounding them up, and even putting them on trains to be sent to Poland to be murdered in Nazi death camps. But the collaboration in those countries stopped at the train station. Now, I'm not saying this to in any way condone what was done, but we have to differentiate between collaboration that included mass murder and collaboration that stopped at the train station. The situation in Eastern Europe was very different. The Nazis integrated many of these peoples, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Belarusians, Russians, Ukrainians, Croatians into the mechanism of mass murder. There were special death squads created in Eastern Europe, like the Latvian Arais Commando, the Lithuanian Ypatinga Buras, the 12th Lithuanian Auxiliary Police Battalion, which murdered tens of thousands of Jews in their own native country, but also outside their native country. The Nazis deported thousands of Jews from Eastern Europe to all three Baltic countries to be murdered, and also sent local security police units from the Baltic countries to other countries to help murder the Jews. Now, because of the depth of collaboration and the particularly lethal nature of this collaboration, many of the people who participated in the crimes against the Jews during the Shoah in these countries knew that when the Russians came, and the Russians were advancing from the east and about to conquer, to liberate these areas or occupy these areas, depending on your vantage point, they would be caught, they would be arrested, they'd be put on trial and given extremely harsh sentences. In some cases, those who remained behind were actually executed, and others were sent for long terms to the Gulag. So many of these people ran away, and they found themselves in Germany and Austria in displaced persons camps, where they posed as innocent refugees and told about how they wanted to start a new life running away from their homeland, which unfortunately had been occupied by the communists. And the fact that they were communists, that they were anti-communists, obviously forced them to flee. Now, that, in a sense, was true, but they simply neglected to mention the other part, which was the real reason why they were running away, which was, of course, to escape justice and to get as far away as possible for the crime. And they wanted to go to anti-communist countries, which wouldn't turn them over to the communists, countries which were less affected by the war, not invaded by the Nazis, countries which with perhaps a weak historical memory, countries where there were already local emigre groups of their own who really didn't care if they had murdered Jews during the Holocaust. So what better place to run to than the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, New Zealand? Now, if the immigration authorities in these countries had done their homework, and if they had a far better knowledge of the events of World War II and the identity of the people actually involved, then history would have taken a different turn. But although the immigration authorities asked the right questions, what did you do? Did you ever fight against the Allies, for example? Was one of the questions on the American immigration forms. List all the places that you've been in the last years, where you worked, etc. Were you ever a member of a movement that persecuted people because of their ethnic origin or religion? Had these people been able to correctly evaluate the immigration forms, then of course they never would have been admitted. But these people told tall tales. They were farmers, they were officials, they were peasants, they were anything but war criminals, of course. So as strange or almost unbelievable as this may sound, within 7 years after the end of World War II, the United States, for example, which sacrificed 200,000 American soldiers killed in Europe to save Europe from Nazism, admitted thousands of Nazi war criminals. Canada, Australia, Great Britain, all the same story. Now, it took almost 3 decades until the American authorities started waking up and realized that there might be Nazi war criminals in the United States. Some of you might remember a book called Wanted, The Nazis in America, by a journalist named Howard Bloom. Elizabeth Holtzman, the congresswoman from Brooklyn, took up the cause. There was a GAO investigation, General Accounting Office, and lo and behold, the conclusion was, yes, there are Nazi war criminals in America. Surprise, surprise. Now, just to give you an example of some of the people who were able to enter the United States, let me tell you about a man named Antanas Impulavicius, who was the commander of the 12th Lithuanian Auxiliary Police Battalion, which murdered an estimated 50,000 Jews in Lithuania and in Belarus, and emigrated under his own name to the United States. Now, the United States faced a very serious legal problem in dealing with these cases. According to American law, they could not be prosecuted in the United States because the crimes had been committed outside the United States and the victims were not American. On the other hand, they couldn't simply ignore these people. So what do? Well, I'm sure you all know the story of Al Capone. You know the story of Al Capone? You know what happened with Al Capone? They wanted to nail him for murder, and they ended up putting him in jail for income tax evasion. And this is, you'll excuse me, but this is somewhat similar. When these people filled out their immigration applications, when they became citizens, they were asked specific questions, they told lies, they violated immigration and naturalization law. Now, the good news was that it was relatively easy to win such cases because you didn't have to prove that someone murdered someone. All you had to do is prove that the person had lied. And, by the way, there's something very interesting you should know. If you want to become an American, you need good character, okay? If you're born in America, for example, you don't necessarily need good character, okay? So obviously, if someone served in the Allies Commando, or was a guard at Sobibor, or at Majdanek, or at Auschwitz, they obviously don't have good character. And all the Americans had to do, the Office of Special Investigations, was to produce a roster, a document, many of which were available and could be found in the archives, which clearly showed that this person had served during the war in that capacity. The bad news, of course, was the problem of the punishment. All the Americans could do was to strip the people of their citizenship, deport them from the United States. Had there been a country or countries willing to extradite them, to try them on criminal charges, that, of course, would have been excellent. But the only country that wanted to extradite these people was the Soviet Union. And who would send people to stand trial in the Soviet Union, where the justice system was not exactly ideal? In any event, the Americans started the process, and they were working with great success, and I spent 6 years working for them in Israel, looking for documents, providing them with a lot of background material and finding survivors, and trying to do everything possible to help them. But towards the end of the 6th year, I was involved in a fascinating investigation which actually sent my personal career as a Nazi hunter in a different direction. And the story is as follows. In 1984, the Simon Wiesenthal Center sent a request to the National Archives asking for any and all information regarding Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz. And lo and behold, the center received a document of a U.S. Counterintelligence Corps officer, Benjamin Gorby, which said that according to an informant, the American Army had arrested and released Joseph Mengele near Vienna in 1946. Shocking. Absolutely unbelievable. No one ever heard about this. And if it was true, it was absolutely terrible. No one had found Mengele. He had never been put on trial. So the center pressed the American authorities to take action in this regard, and the American government decided that the U.S. Marshals will look for Joseph Mengele, even though ostensibly there's no reason for America to seek out Joseph Mengele. They would investigate if he had ever entered the United States. And the OSI, the office where I worked, the Office of Special Investigations of the U.S. Justice Department, would conduct a historical investigation whether or not this story was true. And it turned out that the person who was the key to the story was a survivor of the Holocaust named David Freiman. He had worked in Mengele's laboratory in Auschwitz, and it was he who told the U.S. officer that Mengele had been arrested and released in 1946, and I was the person who was asked to find him. Now, how do you find a person like this? Well, it just so happens that one of the most important archives, collections of archives in Yad Vashem, the Israeli National Memorial and Research Center, is something called the International Tracing Service. And it's, today you'd call it a database set up by the Red Cross in the aftermath of World War II, when millions of requests were sent to the Red Cross about the fate of friends and relatives. And the Red Cross began collecting all the information possible and obligated any person who wanted privileges as a refugee to register with the ITS. Now, the ITS was not arranged according to a regular alphabet, so it took me a while to get the hang of it. And what became clear to me, I had initially thought it was only Jews listed, survivors and Jews who've been killed listed, but it became very clear to me there were millions of non-Jews listed. And that sort of lit a red light in my mind, because I knew from my research that many of the Nazi war criminals living in the United States, practically all of them, had been refugees and had emigrated posing as refugees to the United States, in 99% of the cases under their own names. And these cards had the information not only when the people were born, and some few details about where they were during the war, but where they emigrated to after World War II. So in other words, this was an absolute, could be an absolute gold mine of information. So I made an experiment. I made up a list of 49 Lithuanians and Latvians that I knew were actively involved in mass murder, and went looking for their names in the ITS. Lo and behold, 16 names, 10 of which had a destination, the ones who went to the United States, even a first address. Bingo. Now, at this time, the United States was the only country prosecuting Nazi war criminals of the Anglo-Saxon democracies. Australia had started an investigation, Canada had started an investigation, in England, they didn't even know they had a problem. So at this point, I was getting a little tired of Washington, to be honest, of working with Washington, so I went to Rabbi Marvin Hayer, who's the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and I suggested to him that using this information, we make a final international effort to convince Australia and Canada and Great Britain initially to take legal action against these Nazi war criminals and set up a special office in those countries to prosecute these people. And he agreed, he immediately agreed, saw the potential, and I set up an office in Jerusalem, we started churning out lists. Hundreds and hundreds of suspects who went to those 3 countries. And as a result, we helped convince those countries, Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, Great Britain in 1991, to pass special laws to enable prosecution of Nazi war criminals in those countries. And there's no question that on a moral level, on a historic level, on a judicial level, this was a tremendous achievement. And what it also did was help focus public attention on one of the lesser-known chapters of the Holocaust, which was the collaboration in Eastern Europe. Now, I want to fast forward to Operation Last Chance, but before I do that, I want to say a few words about a very important case that we had in Croatia, which inspired us and gave us hope that Operation Last Chance could have a tremendous impact in Eastern Europe. And that's the case of a man called Dinko Šakić. I don't know how many of you know the history of Croatia or Yugoslavia during the war, but from 1941 to 1945, the Nazis set up a satellite state in Croatia, which was run by the local fascist movement called Ustaša. And the Ustaša were notorious anti-Semites. They hated the Serbs with a passion. They hated the Gypsies. They hated everyone who wasn't a pro-Ustaša Catholic Croat. And their main goal of their regime was, first of all, to eliminate all the minorities in the country. In order to do so, they set up a series of concentration camps all over, the largest of which was a camp called Jasenovac. In Jasenovac, 90,000 civilians were murdered during the years 41 to 45, and many of them in the most cruel fashion imaginable, with swords, daggers, axes, no gas chambers. Not a single German anywhere to be found. They didn't need Germans there because the Germans knew that the Croatians were so dedicated to mass murder of their enemies that they didn't have to be there. In any event, we found out that Dinko Šakić, who was one of the commanders of Jasenovac, was living in Argentina, and we exposed him there, and we had him extradited to Croatia. And his trial became a milestone, actually a watershed in the history of the country. Now, in order to give you a little understanding of why it was so important, let me tell you the following story. On July 4th, 1998, I was in Zagreb with my wife Elisheva. I had come there to submit some evidence. And that night, I don't know if there are any soccer fans or football fans here, but that night was the quarterfinals of the World Cup, July 4th, 1998, Croatia against Germany, and I think it was in Lyon, France. And of course, everyone naturally expected the Germans to trounce the Croatians, even though Croatians have very good sports teams. Sure enough, Croatia wins 3-0. Unbelievable upset. I was walking through the streets. Every time Croatia scored a goal, the streets literally shook. I thought we were in the middle of an earthquake. In any event, after the game was over, we walked out from the hotel, and immediately we see a group of young men, about 7 young men in their early mid-20s, coming towards us waving a gigantic flag. And they were yelling at the top of their lungs, Dinko Šakić, Dinko Šakić. Now, you have to understand, Dinko Šakić, he's the commander of Jasenovac. He's in jail awaiting trial. He didn't score the goals for Croatia in the match against Germany, right? You understand that? But that's just a small, and why are they yelling it? Because he's a hero. He was an ardent Croatian patriot. He's someone who I'm sure would have given his life that Croatia should be independent from Yugoslavia. And the beauty of this trial was that Croatia finally became independent from Yugoslavia. And what do? They put Dinko Šakić on trial. And they convict him. And they give him 20 years. And he dies in prison. It changed the whole tenor of the debate and public discussion of the Holocaust. Fast forward to 2002. With the help of Arya Rubin and Targum Shlishi Foundation, we start Operation Last Chance. We realize time is running out. We have to be more proactive. And we start offering financial rewards for information which will help us bring Nazi war criminals to trial. So over the last 7 years, I've been contacted, our office has been contacted, I estimate, by about maybe 3,000 people, maybe even more. But of course, not every one of these calls is a valuable call. You know, I often get these phone calls telling me how how someone had a terrible fight with his neighbor who's 85 years old and has a German accent, and therefore must be a Nazi war criminal, right? Aren't all those people Nazi war criminals? In any event, each of the names each of the names of the suspects has to pass 3 tests. Credibility, the person has to be alive and young enough to stand trial, and they cannot, he or she, by the way, we had some women, he or she cannot have been prosecuted previously. In any event, we, as President Rosenberg noted, have already turned over 100 names to local prosecutors, and they've yielded dozens of murder investigations, a couple of arrest warrants, a couple of extradition requests. So I want to just briefly tell you about 2 cases. The first case is actually an exceptional case because Operation Last Chance was established to find Nazis we didn't know about. This case was a well-known case, the case of Dr. Aribert Heim. Heim was a doctor in Mauthausen, nicknamed Dr. Death, because he used to inject the inmates with phenol directly into their hearts. In other words, people came to the clinic hoping to get cured of some medical problem. They ended up being murdered. Used to cut off limbs without anesthesia, castrate people without anesthesia, perform all sorts of medical experiments. He had body parts in his clinic as decorations. And he was actually arrested by the Americans after the war, held without trial for 2 years. No one knows why he wasn't put on trial. 1962, he was working as a gynecologist, of all things, in Baden-Baden, and the West Germans are about to arrest him, and he disappears. Disappears into thin air. Simon Wiesenthal writes in 1967 he's in Egypt. But there's no proof, there's no verification. As time goes by, people lose interest in the case. And then in 2004, one of his sons, he had 2 sons living in Germany and an illegitimate daughter in Chile. One of his sons committed a financial crime, and the German police checked all the bank accounts of the Heim family, and lo and behold, an account with $2 million in a bank in Berlin. So if Aribert Heim is dead and he's in his 90s, how come no one took the money? Well, apparently Aribert Heim is probably alive. So the German police set up a task force. They hear we're starting Operation Last Chance in Germany in a press conference at the Bundestag, German parliament, and they asked us to name Aribert Heim as the #1 target. And from that day, we started getting information, what we call sightings, of Dr. Aribert Heim, who, by the way, is very easily recognized because he's 6'4" and he wears size 14 shoes, and he has his dueling scar over here. I mean, that could have been removed, but the other 2 things he couldn't change. 6'4", size 14. Now, if I had $1 for every sighting of Aribert Heim, I would be a rich man. Vietnam, Japan, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Vancouver, Toronto, you name it. But in the meantime, there's no Heim. Now, about a year and a half ago, we were getting really, we wanted to really make a final push. In the meantime, the original prize for finding Heim, which was 130,000 euros offered by the German government to their credit, we doubled that, and then I nudged the Austrians for a year and a half to get them to add money to the pot because he was born in Austria, educated in Austria, committed his crimes in Austria. They added only 50,000. But 50,000 is better than nothing. In any event, 310,000 euros waiting for the person who will give us the information to lead us to Arbeit Heim. After intensive consultations with the German task force, we reached the conclusion the key to the case is his illegitimate daughter, who lives in a city called Puerto Montt in Chile. Now, she was the subject of many investigations, and it seemed clear that she was traveling many times from Puerto Montt across the Andes to a city called Bariloche, and also in Patagonia, a city which was a place where Nazi war criminals had hidden in the past, most famously Erich Pribke from the Rome Gestapo. In any event, we went down there, and we sort of had, this was like a twofold project. We were the public face, as we basically tried to get as much attention as possible to the fact that there's a 310,000 euro reward, while at the same time there was surveillance, there were all sorts of wiretapping and things of the sort. At a certain point, we thought we had him. We were contacted, actually this man initially contacted the Israeli embassy in Santiago, telling us the following story. He lives on a very large island called Chiloa, opposite Puerto Montt, and the husband of Heim's daughter grew up on that island. He no longer lives there, but he grew up there. And not long, several weeks before, this man met Ivan de Harcher, that's the son-in-law of Arbeit Heim, coming out of a supermarket in Chiloa with his arms full of groceries. And he asked Ivan, what are you doing? He didn't say no. He said, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? He said, I'm here to visit an elderly relative. Now, this person who told us the story knew that Ivan de Harcher didn't have any elderly relatives left on Chiloa. He also knew that the family had an estate in the island, deep in the forest, where there was like a dacha, deep in the forest, where an elderly German woman was seen, going in and out, who very well might have been a caretaker. So we hoped that we finally found where he was, but it turns out that it wasn't him. In any event, not long ago, about 9 months ago, all of a sudden there's a report by the New York Times, by CDF, Arbeit Heim died in Cairo. Okay? Now, the key witness in this report was the son, Heim's son in Germany, Rudiger, who 6 months previously had said he hadn't seen his father for decades. Now he's telling that he visited with him very often, he watched the Atlanta Olympics with him shortly after he died, and then he told the following story. First of all, in the wake of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, Arbeit Heim converted to Islam because he was afraid that Egypt would turn him over. I mean, he obviously didn't know the Egyptians. But in any event, before he died, he supposedly said he wanted to donate his body to science. But the problem was that that's against Islam, which forbids autopsies. So he had been adopted by a Muslim family in Cairo, and when the family heard that the son was going to donate the body to science, they stole his body and they threw it into a mass grave for paupers, to which thousands of bodies are thrown every year. Now, you all understand how convenient this is. If there's 17 years worth of bodies above that corpse, how on earth are we be able to find them? And the only way we can verify that it is the body of Arbeit Heim is by doing a DNA test and by doing the forensics, which is the teeth, checking the teeth. So we can't close the case. In the meantime, unfortunately, he has not been found. It's definitely, there's no question he was in Egypt, okay? And he might have died in Egypt, but there's no way we can close the case at the moment. There's no proof of his death. One last little story, okay? Some of you are probably wondering how we work. So I want to illustrate with the following story from Operation Last Chance. One day I get an email from a young Scotsman saying the following. He lives in Scotland, he has a Hungarian girlfriend, and the Hungarians in Scotland have social affairs, to which an elderly Hungarian comes who brags that he participated in the deportations to Auschwitz. This guy says, I'm appalled by this. I know about the Holocaust. I saw a BBC movie on the deportation of Hungarian Jewry. Maybe someone over there at the Wiesenthal Center can investigate this and shut this guy up. That's what he said, shut him up, okay? So I immediately wrote to this guy, thanking him for taking the effort, and I said, listen, you said his name was Stephen Brandon. Well, to be very honest, that is not a Hungarian name. What's his real name? And do you know where he was involved in deportation? So right away he answers back, you're right, his real name is István Boydesó. That is a Hungarian name, okay? But he didn't know where he was involved, and we started looking for István Boydesó in the records of Yad Vashem, couldn't find anything. A couple of months later, a Scottish journalist from the Glasgow Herald comes to Jerusalem to interview me, and I told him about the case. I said, listen, I really need your help. Call up this István Boydesó and tell him you want to do a big feature story in the Glasgow Herald about Hungarians in Scotland. It's a very important topic, you know. It's really something that everyone should know about, okay? And go over there and interview this guy and find out where he was involved, because without that, we'll never get anywhere. Okay. So Michael Turney is the name of the journalist, terrific guy. Calls me, he finally goes there, he convinces, Boydesó immediately agreed to be interviewed. And was so happy to hear that there's going to be a feature story on the Hungarians in Scotland in the Glasgow Herald. In any event, the next day, Michael Turney calls me up and says, listen, you're not going to believe this. There's good news and there's even better news. The good news is we found out that Boydesó is from Miskolc. That's a large city, relatively large city in Hungary. 12,000 Jews deported from there in June of '44. But listen to this. There's a photograph on his wall of a Hungarian gendarmerie officer who's not Boydesó, someone else, and I asked him, who is this guy? So he said to me, oh, this is Sándor Kapiro. He's a much higher officer, and I'm in contact with him all the time. Wonderful, wonderful. What could be better than that, right? Now, I have to admit, to be perfectly honest, I had no idea who Sándor Kapiro was. I don't know the name of every Nazi, unfortunately, and this is one I don't know. But I went to Yad Vashem, and I immediately went to visit the expert on Hungary in Yad Vashem, Dr. Bar Shaked, a wonderful fellow, very orthodox, ultra-orthodox man. And I told him, listen, we have to start looking at Miskolc, because Boydesó is from Miskolc. But he also talked to me about a higher-ranking officer with whom he's in contact, a man named Sándor Kapiro. And you had to see the look on Bar Shaked's face. First of all, he went white. And then he said, and remember, he's a very orthodox person, ultra-orthodox person. He said, you mean to say that son of a bitch is still alive? That was his spontaneous response. Now, he knew who Sándor Kapiro was. Sándor Kapiro was one of the Hungarian officers who organized the massacre in Novi Sad, Serbia, on January 23rd, 1942, of at least 1,300, mostly Jews, but also Serbs and Roma. Now, this case was also a very unique case for one reason. Kapiro and the other officers had actually been put on trial in Hungary for violating the Code of Honor of the Hungarian Army. They had all been convicted, they had all been sentenced, but they had never been punished, because shortly after the end of the trial, the Nazis invaded Hungary, March 19, 1944. They canceled the convictions, gave them promotions, and sent them back to the field. And after that, Kapiro disappeared, but all of a sudden, he apparently is still alive. Now, there was one very critical element missing from the information. In other words, Kapiro he's a bad guy, no question. He's alive, right? But what's missing? Where is he? Michael Turney didn't get that information. So I called him, I said, listen, you've got to call up Boydesó again. And you've got to ask him, where does he live? Okay. Next day, we get information, he lives in Hungary. Okay, that's good, but Hungary's a big country. Now, I have these two wonderful helpers in Hungary, members of the Faith Church, great lovers of Israel, and they also work at the Holocaust Museum, Sylvia Dittel and Tibor Pesci, and they do my undercover work in Hungary. So I called them up and said, listen, guys, take the Budapest phone book, we're going to start there, see if you can find Sándor Kapiro. If we don't find him, we'll get a detective, we'll track him down for sure, we have to get this guy. Okay. There are 3 Sándor Kapiros in the phone book. They call the first one, he's not home, they leave a message. They were posing as students, writing a paper on the very important subject of the gendarmerie in Hungary during World War II. The second one was a famous artist, so it obviously wasn't the guy. The third one, the following conversation takes place. Tibor is on the phone. Hello, is this the home of Sándor Kapiro? A woman answers. Is this the home of Sándor Kapiro? Yes. Was Sándor Kapiro your husband? Yes. Was Sándor Kapiro in the gendarmerie during World War II? Yes. Was he in Novi Sad in 1942? Yes. But he died. Terrible. We blew it, huh? But not really. The woman said that he died 2 years ago. But Tibor forgot that I had told him that Boydeshaw was in constant contact with Shandor Capiro. So it couldn't have been this Shandor Capiro. And an hour later, the real Shandor Capiro calls up. And he tells him the whole story, just neglecting to mention that he was convicted for murder. Actually not legally convicted for murder, but that he was involved in the massacre at Novi Sad, etc. Now, the key element in a case like this, after we find the guy, and after, we know we have the evidence, we found the guy, okay? The key element, of course, now is what's his state of health? And Tibor immediately said to Shandor Capiro, listen, I'd like to come to visit you. I want to meet you face to face. I have many questions. And Capiro said, no, you can't visit me. I'm very old. I can't accept visitors. And this I have to say, it got me so nervous. For 2 months, I was having these terrible stomach aches. And I was sure it had nothing to do with what I was eating or anything of the sort. I was nervous that this case would go down the tubes. Anyway, 2 months later, I'm supposed to meet with the prosecutors in Budapest. The day before, Tibor and Sylvia want to take me for a little trip. And they refuse to tell me where we're going. So we cross the river, we cross the Danube to Buda from Pest, and we're walking on Leo Frankel Street. And lo and behold, we get to 78 Leo Frankel Street, where Shandor Capiro lives. And his name is on the door, and he lives right opposite a synagogue. Very convenient, right? Yeah. And in any event, a woman walked out of the house, walked out of his brownstone. It's an apartment building with eight families. And I told Sylvia, you've got to get a hold of this woman, and you've got to engage her in conversation and find out what's with Shandor Capiro. Is he alive? Is he healthy? I mean, is there any chance we can get him on trial? So Sylvia starts talking to this woman, makes up a whole bull story about why she wants to see Capiro and all this business. Anyway, the story is like this. Shandor Capiro came back to Budapest several years ago. He lives alone. That's already great. That's terrific. Okay? And, by the way, there's a custom in this apartment building. The custom is to have block parties. There's parties for all the residents. You know, I'm waiting for him to say, but you know, Mr. Capiro, he's very old and he can't come to the parties. No, Shandor Capiro organizes these parties. Okay? Shandor Capiro organizes parties. My stomach aches disappeared. Okay? Now, the next day I met with the prosecutors, gave them the information, and I sort of politely suggested that instead of organizing the parties at 78 Leo Frankel Street, he should organize the parties in the Budapest jail. In any event, to make a long story short, finally, several weeks ago, he was arrested, finally for questioning. His passport was taken away, and within the next few weeks, we are expecting a decision by the Hungarian government to put him on trial. Now, two things about this case that are very important, and you might find this hard to believe. Shandor Capiro's year of birth is 1914. You know how old that makes him? 95 years old. Lives alone, in good health, runs around, she's suing me, okay? Runs around giving interviews for films, for newspapers, and the like, and is a very active, alive person, okay? There's no reason on earth he should be ignored simply because his DOB, date of birth, says 1914. But one other fascinating fact. Shandor Capiro was originally sentenced to 10 years in prison in this famous trial. But the thinking was really obtuse. And the thinking was as follows. First of all, he's Dr. Shandor Capiro. He's a doctor of law. And already in 1942, when he was in Novi Sad with Hungarian troops, he was a lawyer. Now, when Capiro was given the orders, he was in charge of a certain area of town, an area full of Jews. And he was in charge of the roundups of the Jews in that area. When he received the orders, Shandor Capiro said to the officer, I want these orders in writing. The officer responded, orders like this are only transmitted verbally. In other words, Shandor Capiro carried out those orders. He didn't refuse to carry out the orders which he clearly realized were illegal, immoral. So in other words, Shandor Capiro is a person who's worried about his alibi. He's not worried about the fate of the innocent men, women, and children who were murdered as a result of his efforts and the efforts of others. And I always say that if, in a certain sense, Shandor Capiro is a moral monster of the Holocaust. He's the kind of person, educated, intelligent, who should have known better, who made the Holocaust possible. I was if people like Chandra Capiro are willing to go through with it, that's why tragedies like this take place, and that's precisely why it should be brought to trial and punished. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions and answers. There should be 2 mics on either side. Please make sure you get a mic so everyone can hear it. Please keep your questions brief and your comments briefer. Thank you.
How has the internet changed, improved, helped your investigations?
Okay, there's no question that it has helped, but we still get information the more traditional ways, by phone, by fax, letters. By the way, one of the best pieces of information we ever got was an amazing letter we got from Vienna after we had published an ad in Austria for Operation Last Chance. Just a little story, if we have time. You know that we have press conferences to announce Operation Last Chance, and then we publish ads. And the most painful ad for me, and the most expensive ad we ever paid for, was an ad in a newspaper called the Kronenzeitung in Austria. Because it's a very right-wing paper which was supported Haider, and it's really not the kind of paper we like. But on the other hand, if you want to reach people who know Nazis, you have to put an ad in the Kronenzeitung, right? In any event, a couple of months after the ad appeared, all of a sudden we got a letter from Vienna from a woman saying that she's sick of the Holocaust denial and the neo-Nazis in Austria. She wants us to know that one of the monsters of the camps is living at Schiffmühlerstrasse 100 in Vienna, a woman named Erna Walisch. And it turns out that it was true. Erna Walisch had served in Ravensbrück and in Majdanek. And we got the Austrians to open up an investigation against her. It was a very interesting case for several reasons. She admitted that she had guarded people, taken people to be gassed, had guarded them so that they couldn't escape. And there was also indications of violence against inmates. And initially the Austrians didn't want to prosecute her. They said what she did was passive complicity in genocide. Can you believe that? And of course that's under statute of limitations in Austria, where there hasn't been a successful prosecution of a Nazi in more than 30 years. So, and one other very, very interesting anecdote was that Erna Walisch got pregnant in Majdanek. And she eventually had to be transferred. So you understand what she was doing while tens of thousands of people were being murdered. And we gave that information to the Austrian newspapers, and not a single one printed it. Anyway, to make a long story short, I went to the Poles. They filed testimony against her. The case was reopened. And when the case was reopened, she and her residents were exposed in a sense. And there was a sort of an onslaught of media. And in 10 days, she dropped dead. She died, unexpectedly. Listen, I have to say, I'm not happy. I was really upset. I pray for the health of Nazi war criminals. At least those that can be brought to justice, okay? And you can imagine what kind of trial there would have been of a woman, guard from Majdanek in Austria. It would have been unbelievable, but it didn't happen.
Thank you. Looking back at the history of the immediate post-war years, how much do you think, or could you speak a bit about how the climate of the Cold War maybe facilitated this in terms of people in the United States or Great Britain, looking the other way, for example, in terms of trying to burnish their anti-communist credentials by allowing people in, and looking the other way in terms of collaborators on the Eastern Front?
Okay, you're 100% right. That's exactly what happened. It's one of the causes why those people were admitted. In other words, the Allies, Western Allies, were trying to build up Germany as a West Germany, as a bulwark against communism, and they were more concerned to prevent the entry of communists than they were to check the fascist backgrounds of these people.
One quick question. How long is your organization going to stay in existence?
Okay, first of all, I think it's important to stress that hunting Nazis, with all due respect to hunting Nazis, is not the most important or the major primary objective of the Sion Wiesenthal Center at this point. The primary objective of the Sion Wiesenthal Center is to combat contemporary anti-Semitism, Islamic extremism, terrorism, etc. And most of the effort and the energies go into that. My office is in charge of hunting Nazis, and we do what we can, and we'll do what we can for as long as we can. And these people can be brought to justice. But as we all understand, this is not an endeavor that will last forever, and within the next few years will be completed.
Yeah, I have a question. Should Nazi war criminals and the like be forgiven? And what role has forgiveness played in your life, given the line of work that you do?
Okay, that's a very good question. So I want to tell you that in all the cases that I've dealt with closely or intensely, I have never encountered a single case of a Nazi war criminal who ever expressed any regret or remorse. Never. And if you take into account the fact that many of these people have been living for decades in countries in which there's much public discussion, education, and deliberation about the Holocaust, you would think that perhaps one of these people, or two, or several of these people might have figured it out that what they did as young men was what they call the Holocaust. But it's never happened. Not one case. So I don't think this is a factor at all. If anything, if people had expressed remorse, it might be a factor in sentencing. But it's certainly not a factor that would lead us to ignore them.
Another question?
Yes, this is just a comment. I'm from Novi Sad, Serbia, and my grandfather,
Can't see. Hi.
hello, and my grandfather survived the razzia or the raid over there.
Right.
So I'm really glad that you captured Shandor at the end. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman, the
Yep. You previously mentioned when you go to some of these countries, or all of them, you experience different levels of assistance as well as the opposite of assistance from officials as well as regular people that you come across. Do you see the generational changes, such as like are the young people of younger generations more helpful, more willing to speak out and take action? Or is it slowly dwindling, the idea of bringing these people to justice?
I think there is a difference in terms of generations, and many of the people who do help us are younger people who grew up now in democracy, in other words, when these countries were democracies. But having said that, there's also plenty of extremism among some of the young people in these countries. And there's a lot of educational work that has to be done. And this is precisely one of the reasons why we tried so hard to get trials in these countries. Because trials, as we saw in the case of Dinko Šakić, have a very, I think, important impact when they're done in the country in which the crimes were committed. In other words, in a country like Croatia, for years, during the existence of Yugoslavia, there were books written about the Ustasha, the Croatian fascists. There was a lot written about it. But in Zagreb and in Croatia, they always said this is Serb propaganda. Okay, now you have, I mean, in that respect, the Šakić case was amazing. You have a person who would have given his life to free Croatia from Yugoslavia. Croatia is finally free of Yugoslavia, and what do? They put him on trial for mass murder in Jasenovac. It doesn't get better than that, I'm telling you. It's really amazing in that respect.
I'm from Hungarian origin, and I lived most of my life in Israel, and spent a month in the 80s in Budapest, and it's the only experience in my whole existence of 60 years that I actually experience anti-Semitism in the environment. I'm just wondering, to what extent are you getting help from the Hungarian people and authorities in prosecuting these people?
Okay, we had 3 cases of Hungarian Nazi war criminals collaborators as discovered in Operation Last Chance. The record of the Hungarian government was mixed. In the Zente case, a case that I mentioned before in Australia, the Hungarian government very promptly asked for the extradition of Karoli Charles Zente from Australia. I have to say, almost to my surprise, I was very pleasantly surprised by the manner in which they handled the case. In the Capiro case, I have to say that even though it now looks like there's a very good chance he'll be brought to trial, the Hungarians waited, and they probably thought that they just let him die, because they took a look at the date of birth and they figured he won't last. But Capiro fooled them, and now they have to put him on trial. So it's a mixed record. In the Polgar case, the 3rd case, the person who headed the Arrow Cross in Budapest, they immediately opened up an investigation, and I would say that the Hungarians are very far from the worst in this regard in Eastern Europe. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, much, much, much worse, and no political will to prosecute. Maybe just in a word about Lithuania, because it's a country that's very important because of the role played by the collaborators and the fact that it had the highest victimology rate in Europe, 96.4%. 212,000 out of 220,000 Jews who lived under Nazi occupation were murdered. The Lithuanians actually held 3 trials, but they waited in the first 2 cases, which were the most important cases, of the commander and deputy commander of the Lithuanian security police in Vilna district. They waited until they were medically unfit to be put on trial, and then they put them on trial. They actually passed special laws in their parliament to allow first the investigation of genocide suspects unfit for trial, medically unfit, then to indict genocide suspects medically unfit, and then to have video trials from the homes, the bedrooms of the defendants. And not a single one of them sat 1 minute in jail. And recently, many of you might have heard that instead of prosecuting Nazis, the Lithuanians wanted to bring to trial none other than Dr. Yitzhak Arad, the former chief education officer of the IDF, the former head of Yad Vashem, a renowned Holocaust scholar, whose crime, in quotation marks, in the minds of the Lithuanians was that he was a Soviet anti-Nazi partisan.
In the 3rd row, please.
Thank you. I have a very strong personal interest in Scandinavian Jewry, and I was wondering during your work if you have run across any collaborators in Scandinavia.
Yes, we have. And we encountered quite a few in Sweden, of all places, and it might be a bit surprising because Sweden was neutral during World War II. But first of all, there were Swedes who ran away to Norway to join the Viking division of the SS, and there were Latvian and Estonian Nazi war criminals who escaped from Latvia and Estonia to Sweden. Sweden today is the only country in the world in which there is a statute of limitations on genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The only country in the world. Until 2 years ago, Norway also had a statute of limitations on those, but after, among other things, pressure from the Wiesenthal Center, and every year in our annual report, we gave them an F grade, a failing grade. Okay, Norway changed the law. They canceled the statute of limitations, but didn't make it retroactive. So in other words, as far as Holocaust cases, we can't do anything in Norway. We can't do anything in Sweden. In Denmark, there's an important case of a Dane by the name of Søren Kam, who murdered an anti-Nazi editor of a Danish anti-Nazi newspaper called Henrik Clemensen, and was sentenced to death in Denmark, but ran away to Germany and was protected there for many years. He was about to be extradited back to Denmark when a judge in Munich decided that what he did was not murder, for which he had to be extradited under the new EU regulations, but rather manslaughter, which I frankly found I did not agree with the judgment, but that's a situation. We're trying to get him tried again, but we're not sure we'll succeed. That's a complicated story. It's too complicated. I can speak to you afterwards about Finland.
I wanted to know, since you've had so much almost personal investigation of these people, if it's given you any insight into why they did what they did, and, as you've noted, their lack of regret for what they did?
Okay. I think that most of the people who were involved in these crimes were not motivated by racist anti-Semitism. Because in their case, they were motivated by a combination of traditional anti-Semitism for religious reasons, economic reasons, nationalistic reasons, ethnic reasons, and political opportunism. In the Baltics, for example, they thought that the Germans would restore them to independence. Those countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, had been independent from the end of World War I till 1940 when they were occupied by the Soviets, and a year later the Nazis came. So that's why, that was the basis for their participation. It had nothing to do with the superiority of the Aryan race, had nothing to do with the racist anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany. Those were the factors, and the conditions created by Nazi Germany during World War II, when it was more natural or normal to kill a Jew than to save a Jew in those countries. Now, what's particularly interesting about the crimes of the Holocaust is that most of them were committed by people who were definitely normative people, not psychotic, not insanely criminal. These are people who, if not for the events of World War II, would almost certainly never have been involved in murder. And that makes it even worse. In other words, these are not, criminal types. These are people who made the wrong decision with very, very dire consequences.
Simon Wiesenthal wrote a book that something about the title was Sunflowers.
Sunflower.
And in the end, he tells about the young German soldier who came over to his bedside while he was in the hospital. So I'm referring to forgiveness. And the young boy said, I didn't mean to be so bad. I didn't mean to hurt people. I had to go into the army, and it was my duty for the Germans to do what I had to do. But I'm very sorry. Will you forgive me? And Simon Wiesenthal turned his head.
Right. Because he knew that only the victims could forgive them. And they weren't around to offer forgiveness.
Liesl.
Thank you for being here, and more importantly, for the work you're doing. It's extremely important. My father, Helmut Norbert Picard, was a German Jew who survived the Holocaust, and he always said that the one thing he would never forget was the face of the SS officer who came for him. And I'm curious to know if, he's no longer alive, but I'm curious to know if you could talk a bit about the experience of the survivors of the Holocaust who have been involved in the search for Nazi war criminals, and if they have reacted in any particular way, if they've been granted closure, what kind of experience or dignity have they had in the process?
Well, firstly, what I know is, mainly from reading and from the contact I had with Mr. Wiesenthal. And there's no question in my mind that Mr. Wiesenthal, who devoted his life to this task, basically found a sense of commitment and purpose after suffering so badly and having been in so many Nazi concentration camps and after losing so many of his members of his extended family. So he's one such case. And there's a couple of other cases, people like Tuvia Friedman, Elliot Wells, Serge Klarsfeld, and other people who for many years were involved in this effort and definitely deserve our thanks and our gratitude. And the fact that they are survivors, I think, played a critical role in it. Personally, I have to say that the only reason I feel I can do this job is because I'm not a survivor or a child of survivors. I think that if I were, I wouldn't survive. I'd be consumed by it, and I wouldn't be able to do it. But that's just my personal feeling.
I have a comment also for you. My father was a Holocaust survivor. He was active in hunting Nazis, and he was the person who found the photo of Adolf Eichmann, and which enabled the search
Manus
for him.
Diamond?
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Okay.
And I don't know if you're aware of the Grupa, this group of people who were active during the Holocaust to save a lot of people, and until today they are still meeting each year with their families, and we are kind of big family.
Well, first of all, I know about your father. That's number one. And it's a fascinating story of your father, Manus Diamant, who got friendly with the with the wife of Adolf Eichmann in order to obtain a photograph so that he could be hunted down. And there's a famous story about your father, which I'm sure you know far better than I do, that he went rowing with the wife and the kids, and he thought to himself, all he has to do, he can just throw them into the lake there in Alta Aussie and be rid of them. And the version that I heard, maybe I'm wrong, was that of course he didn't want to be like them, like the Nazis, and therefore he didn't kill them.
Exactly.
My grandfather, in fact, both my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and that's how they met, was in a refugee camp. And a couple years ago, I wanted to go on the March of the Living, but my grandfather and my grandmother, they say to me, I don't want any of my family members to ever go back there. My question to you is, how can I know that I've tried to persuade them, that it's important for us to actually go back and revisit there, but how can we actually explain, or how can I actually explain to my grandparents that it's important for me to actually not relive what they experienced, but to see how or what they experienced?
Okay, listen, I'm really not qualified to answer that question because I don't know your grandparents, and I don't know what they went through, and I don't know how it connects your desire to go on the March of the Living connects to their personal experiences. But maybe you should ask a professional.
I want to take the last two questions that I saw, the last 1, 2, 3 questions, and then we're going to move to the book signing. Thank you.
Okay, being a child of a mother who left with their family in the nick of time out of Hamburg, came to London where my Upa was promptly thrown into a internment camp because he was a German, whether he was a Jew or not, didn't matter. My question, and of course, noting that the English aristocracy, some of them did have a sympathy for the Germans, and we know about the secret flight, landing in the nobility. My question is, have you had much help once they realized that they had a problem? That's the British government. Have you had much help there? And do you have any interesting cases briefly that you could share?
First of all, there's a whole chapter on England in the book and how we convinced the British government that they had to deal with the issue. But I'll tell you a couple of things that I can't resist telling you. One is that I can tell you we didn't get any help from the nobility. That's for sure. And by the way, after the House of Commons passed a bill allowing the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, the House of Lords twice rejected it. Believe it or not, and then the Commons passed it a third time, and for only the second time in 70 years, Queen Elizabeth overrode the rejection by the House of Lords, signed it into law in June of 1991, and it became the law of the land. But listen, one of the, I think, most painful things I ever read about our efforts were two editorials, one by the Times of London and one by the Telegraph, in early March 1987. As we were we met, after I compiled my first list of British suspects, 17 suspects, we gave it to the British authorities, and we were called to a meeting in London to meet with Douglas Hurd, who was then the Home Secretary. And the Times said, in the wake of the meeting, at which we were informed that Britain didn't want to do anything, okay? The only thing they would check was maybe that the people had violated immigration law when they entered. And the Times wrote that Britain is a Christian country. And as a Christian country, we're not interested in revenge. What these people want is revenge, okay? We're talking about putting people on trial. I don't know how that's revenge, but okay. That was one thing. And then the Times, the Telegraph wrote the next day that something about how that Nazi hunting has become a very unpopular, bloody sport, and that even the Jews of Britain will be very happy when those nudniks from the Simon Wiesenthal Center go home. Just to give you a little insight into the mentality. But there's a whole chapter in the book about it.
Linda.
I am not a child of survivors. My parents were born in this country 103 years ago tomorrow. And, but I grew up with two words, never again, which have been seared into my heart and into my brain. And Simon Wiesenthal lost 87 members of his extended family. And one of the last things he said was, when I die and I meet up with the other survivors of the Holocaust, I will be able to tell them I have never forgotten them. And if FIU will invite me back, I would like to bring the movie of Simon Wiesenthal, The Life and Legacy, I Have Never Forgotten You, and let everybody see the life of this amazing man, which is emulated through the work of Dr. Efraim Zuroff, which is my pleasure to be with today.
Thank you, Linda. I note this gentleman had the last question, if he still wants to ask it. Sir, no? Oh, I might have made a mistake. Okay. Well, on behalf of the Judaic Studies program and the entire FIU community, I want to thank very much the Simon Wiesenthal Center for bringing this event tonight, and the Broad Family Foundation for co-sponsoring it, and especially Dr. Efraim Zuroff for generously donating his time. There's going to be book sales and signing outside. Thank you very much.